I found the pawn shop receipt tucked inside the silk lining of my mother's vintage jewelry box, dated 3 days after my father's funeral. It wasn't for a watch or a ring, but for my grandmother's heirloom silverware, the only thing in this drafty, mourning-filled house that was legally mine. My sister, Thalia, was currently in the kitchen, humming a soft, upbeat tune while she brewed artisanal coffee, the expensive scent of vanilla bean mocking the stale air of our shared grief. I stood in the bedroom, the slip of paper trembling in my hand. The date on the receipt meant that while I was sitting by the window in a catatonic haze of loss, Thalia had been driving into the city to sell my inheritance. "Lyra, are you coming down?" Thalia called out, her voice a perfect blend of manufactured sweetness and sisterly concern. "The real estate agent will be here in 20 minutes. We need to look unified." I tucked the receipt into my pocket, the sharp corner digging into my hip. I walked to the vanity mirror and looked at my reflection. My eyes were hollow, my skin the color of damp parchment. I looked like a woman who had spent 3 years cleaning bedpans and crushing medication into applesauce while my father's mind dissolved. Thalia, by contrast, looked like she had just returned from a retreat. Her hair was glossed, her blazer tailored, her grief worn like a chic accessory that she could take off the moment the cameras, or the lawyers, stopped rolling. I went downstairs. The kitchen was blindingly bright. Thalia had already cleared away the clutter, which was what she called my father's collection of hand-carved birds and the stacks of books I'd been reading to him. In their place sat a marble tray of pastries and her leather-bound planner. "The house is a bit of a relic, isn't it?" Thalia said, not looking up as she poured cream into 2 mugs. "The agent thinks if we do a quick refresh, paint the oak, rip out that old floral carpet in the hallway, we can list it by the end of the month. I've already contacted a staging crew." "The oak is original, Thalia," I said, my voice sounding brittle in the quiet room. "And Dad wanted the house to stay in the family. He told me that every night for a year." Thalia finally looked at me, a small, pitying smile playing on her lips. "He said a lot of things at the end, Lyra. The dementia was loud. We have to be the adults now. My debt from the gallery isn't going to pay itself, and you've been stagnant here for years. This is your ticket to a real life." She pushed a mug toward me. I looked at the dark liquid, then at the empty space on the sideboard where the silver chest used to sit. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the way she moved through the house like a scavenger, picking at the bones of a life I had spent years trying to preserve. "Did you find the silverware, Thalia?" I asked quietly. "I wanted to use it for our last dinner here." The humming stopped. Thalia didn't flinch, but her grip on the marble countertop tightened until her knuckles turned the color of the cream. "The silver? Oh, Lyra, I think Dad must have misplaced it months ago. You know how he was hiding things near the end." She lied with the practiced ease of someone who believed her own convenience was a moral imperative. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle in my chest, a sensation far more powerful than the sorrow that had been drowning me. "You're right," I said, taking a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter. "He did hide things, but sometimes they have a way of being found." Thalia's eyes didn't waver, but a tiny pulse throbbed at the base of her throat. It was the only sign that she knew I was circling a truth she wasn't ready to concede. "Exactly," she said, recovering her poise. "Which is why we need to move fast. If we leave things to linger, more missing items will just turn up as headaches during the inspection." The doorbell rang. The real estate agent had arrived. His name was Vance, a man whose smile was as polished as his Italian loafers. As he walked through the entryway, his eyes immediately began calculating the square footage of our trauma. He didn't see the height marks Dad had carved into the pantry door. He saw outdated molding. "The bones are good," Vance noted, tapping a knuckle against the wood-paneled walls of the study. "But Thalia is right, Lyra. To get the price you both deserve, we need to strip the personality out of this place. Neutrality sells. We need the buyers to see their future, not your father's past." I followed them from room to room like a ghost haunting my own life. Thalia was a whirlwind of efficiency, pointing out which furniture should be hauled to the dump and which curated pieces she wanted to keep for her apartment in the city. She spoke about our family home as if it were a carcass to be butchered. "This desk," Thalia said, running a hand over my father's mahogany roll top. It's too heavy. We'll donate it. No, I said, the word sharper than I intended. Vance and Thalia both turned to look at me. That stays, I use it. Thalia sighed, that soft, performative exhale she used when she wanted to signal to a third party that I was being difficult. Lyra, honey, we talked about this. You can't live in a museum. You're moving into that cute studio downtown, remember? There's no room for a Victorian behemoth. I hadn't agreed to a studio. I hadn't agreed to anything. Thalia had simply started booking movers and sending me links to rental listings. She was trying to shrink my world until I could fit into a box she could easily carry out of her way. After Vance left, Thalia started labeling things with neon green sticky notes. Discard, sell, donate. The green squares looked like toxic mold spreading across my memories. She reached for the small, hand-painted ceramic bowl on the hallway table, the one my mother had used to hold her keys for 30 years. This is chipped, Thalia muttered, hovering the green sticker over it. Leave it, Thalia, I said, my voice low. She turned, the sticker still in her hand. Why are you being like this? I'm doing all the heavy lifting here. I'm the one dealing with the lawyers, the agents, the debt. You're just hovering. I'm hovering because I'm watching you erase him, I said, and I'm watching you erase me. Thalia laughed, a short, dry sound. I'm trying to save us, Lyra. Unlike you, I have a life that requires capital. I have a gallery that's hanging by a thread because I spent the last month playing dutiful daughter at a funeral. I don't have the luxury of being sentimental over a chipped bowl. She slapped the green sticker onto the ceramic. The sound was like a physical blow. I'm going to the hardware store for some neutral paint samples, she said, grabbing her designer bag. Try to be productive while I'm gone. Maybe start packing your closet. Or did you plan on taking the dust bunnies with you too? She swept out the door, the engine of her car purring to life a moment later. Silence returned to the house, heavy and suffocating. I walked over to the hallway table and peeled the green sticker off the bowl. Underneath it, tucked deep into the ceramic curve, was something Thalia had missed, a small brass key I hadn't seen in years. It was the key to the floor safe in the cellar. The one Dad told Thalia was empty and broken years ago when she'd first started asking about his liquid assets. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew where the safe was, hidden under a loose flagstone beneath the laundry preserves. If the silverware was gone, I needed to know what else Thalia was planning to take before I had a chance to claim it. I headed for the basement stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The cellar smelled of damp earth and the fermented sweetness of my father's aging blackberry preserves. It was a space Thalia avoided. She hated the way the shadows clung to the corners and the way the spiders wove thick, dusty curtains between the rafters. To her, this was just a dark hole that lowered the property value. To me, it was where Dad had spent his quietest hours. I moved the heavy wooden crate of mason jars, my muscles aching from the effort. Beneath it lay the uneven flagstone, its edges smoothed by decades of grime. I knelt, the cold of the stone seeping through my jeans, and used a flathead screwdriver to pry it upward. The safe was there, a small steel box embedded in the concrete. My hands shook as I fitted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed in the hollow room. I expected cash. I expected maybe a few bonds or the deed to the house. Instead, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to me in my father's shaky, late-stage handwriting. For Lyra, the one who stayed. Inside wasn't money. It was a collection of dated, handwritten ledgers and a USB drive. I opened the first ledger. My breath hitched. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of loans. For the last 5 years, while I was living on a meager stipend from Dad's savings to keep the house running and his care managed, Thalia had been systematically draining his secondary accounts. $10,000 for gallery expansion, $15,000 for marketing, $8,000 for a research trip to Florence. There were notes in the margins in my father's hand, written during the months when he was still lucid enough to realize he was being bled dry. Thalia says she will pay this back by Christmas. She didn't. Asked for more today. She told me Lyra is complaining about the cost of my nurse. Is this true? I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean my forehead against the cool dampness of the stone wall. She had been gaslighting him, using my name as a weapon to guilt him into handing over his wealth, all while painting me as the resentful caretaker. She wasn't just selling the silverware. She had been harvesting his life for years. The last entry was dated only 2 months ago. Thalia brought a document today. She said it was for the insurance. My eyes are tired. I signed it, but I felt her hand shaking. I think I've made a mistake. I've hidden the key in the blue bowl. I hope Lyra finds it before the green stickers arrive. He knew. Even in the fog of his fatting mind, he had seen her. I heard the heavy thud of the front door upstairs. Thalia was back. Lyra, she called out, her voice echoing down the cellar stairs. Why are the basement lights on? It's disgusting down there. I quickly shoved the ledgers and the USB drive back into the envelope and tucked it into the waistband of my trousers, pulling my sweater down to hide the bulk. I locked the safe, slid the stone back, and dragged the crate of preserves over it just as her expensive heels began to click rhythmically on the wooden stairs. She appeared at the bottom of the flight, silhouetted by the light from the kitchen, looking like a judge in a designer coat. She held a fan of gray and beige paint swatches. What are you doing, Lyra? You're covered in dust. Just looking for the holiday decorations, I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. I thought I might want to keep a few. Thalia stepped into the room, her nose wrinkled in distaste. She looked directly at the crate of preserves I had just moved. Don't bother. It's all junk. I've already hired a junk removal service for Friday. Anything not in a packed box by then is going to the incinerator. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face. You look different. Did you hit your head? No, I said, stepping past her toward the stairs. I just finally realized what color we should paint the house. Oh, and what's that? I looked back at her, the woman who had stolen my father's peace and my grandmother's silver. Transparent, I said. I think it's time everyone saw exactly what's behind these walls. Thalia stared at me, the paint swatches fanned out in her hand like a losing deck of cards. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Transparent, very poetic, Lyra, but poetry doesn't pay the mortgage or the property taxes I've been juggling while you played house. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her I knew about the loans or the lies she'd fed a dying man. Not yet. Instead, I climbed the stairs, the weight of the envelope against my spine feeling like armor. You're right, Thalia. We need a clean break. But if we're going to sell this place for what it's worth, we need to do it right. No staging crew can fake the family legacy look better than a proper open house. An invitation-only event for your gallery clients. Give them a chance to buy the estate experience. Thalia paused at the top of the stairs, her ambition visibly wrestling with her suspicion. I could see the gears turning. She saw a room full of wealthy donors, a chance to network, and a way to look like the grieving, successful daughter. An elite preview, she mused, her tone shifting from irritation to calculation. It would certainly build buzz, but can you handle it? You can barely handle a grocery list lately. I'll handle the house, I said, walking toward the kitchen. You handle the guest list. Bring your biggest investors. Bring the people who think the name Vane stands for integrity. For the next 3 days, the house became a battlefield of aesthetics. Thalia brought in painters to cover the warm, lived-in cream of the living room with a cold, sterile, industrial fog. She moved my father's armchair to the curb, replaced it with a sleek, uncomfortable velvet bench, and hung abstract prints over the spots where our family photos had left faded rectangles on the wallpaper. I spent my time in the study with the door locked, the USB drive plugged into my laptop. The files were a nightmare of digital breadcrumbs. Thalia hadn't just taken loans. She had forged my signature on a renunciation of inheritance for the liquid assets, claiming I had agreed to take the house instead. A house she knew was drowning in the very debt she had created by borrowing against it in Dad's name. She was setting me up to inherit a corpse, while she walked away with the blood. On Thursday night, the house felt like a stranger. The smell of fresh paint was sharp and chemical, masking the scent of the wood oil I'd used for years. Thalia was in the dining room, arranging expensive lilies in a glass vase. "Oh, by the way," she said, her voice casual, "I found a buyer for the mahogany desk, a private collector. They're picking it up Saturday morning, right before the event." I felt the familiar spark of heat in my chest, but I kept my hands still as I folded a napkin. "The desk is mine, Thalia. Dad's will was clear about the study furniture." "The will you're clinging to is old, Lyra," she said, finally looking at me with a cold, hard stare. "There's a newer codicil, signed and witnessed. It gives me power of attorney over the estate's physical assets to settle outstanding debts, including the ones you ran up for his premium care." She was lying. I knew the witness would be her gallery assistant or some paid-off lackey. She thought she had me cornered in a room she had already emptied. "I see," I said, my voice a whisper of its former self. "I suppose there's no point in fighting you then." "Finally," she sighed, turning back to her flowers. "Realism suits you, Lyra. It's much more dignified than desperation." I walked away, heading toward the basement one last time. I wasn't looking for decorations anymore. I was looking for the projector my father used to show old slides on the whitewashed wall of the study. Thalia wanted a show for her investors. I was going to give them a premiere they'd never forget. The morning of the event arrived with a cold, biting rain that streaked the newly cleaned windows. Thalia was a blur of manic energy, directing caterers in the kitchen and obsessing over the placement of the hors d'oeuvres. She wore a dress the color of bruised plums, looking every bit the sophisticated curator of our family's demise. "Lyra, for heaven's sake, change your clothes," she snapped as I walked through the foyer carrying a heavy box. "You look like a groundskeeper. Our guests will be here in 2 hours." "I'm just setting up the legacy room in the study," I said, my voice flat and obedient. "You wanted a story to sell, Thalia. I'm giving them the history of the Vane family." She paused, a tray of crystal flutes in her hands. "Just don't make it depressing. No one wants to buy a house that smells like a funeral. Keep it nostalgic. Golden hour memories only." "Oh, it'll be memorable," I promised. I retreated to the study and locked the door. I had spent the night working. On the USB drive, I had found more than just ledgers. I had found a series of voice memos my father had recorded in his final weeks. He had been terrified. He'd recorded Thalia's voice during their negotiations, her sharp, impatient tone cutting through his confusion as she pressured him to sign the codicil. "Just sign it, Dad. Lyra doesn't need to know. She's already looking at nursing homes for you. Do you want to die in a sterile box, or do you want to help me save the gallery?" The recording made my skin crawl. I edited the files into a loop, layering them over a slideshow of the family photos Thalia had thrown into the discard pile. I set up the old projector, hidden behind a modern floral arrangement she'd placed on the mahogany desk. At 7 o'clock, the cars began to line the gravel driveway. Men in charcoal overcoats and women draped in cashmere poured into the house. These were the people Thalia relied on, the board members of the Ethelgard Museum, the private collectors who funded her lifestyle. They sipped champagne and admired the industrial fog walls, completely unaware that the woman hosting them was a vulture in silk. I moved through the crowd in a simple black dress, playing the role of the quiet, grieving sister. I watched Thalia hold court in the center of the living room, her laughter ringing out like a silver bell. "It's bittersweet, of course," I heard her tell a prominent critic, her hand resting delicately on her heart. "But Lyra and I both feel that this house needs a family with a future. We've given so much of ourselves to this place. It's time to let go." She caught my eye and toasted me with her glass, a triumphant glint in her gaze. She thought she had won. She thought the difficult sister had finally been broken. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the chatter. The room fell silent. "My sister has worked so hard to prepare this house for you, but before we discuss the listing, I'd like to invite you into the study. We've prepared a short presentation on the true history of the Vane estate, a look at what it really took to maintain this legacy." Thalia's smile flickered. She hadn't cleared this. "Lyra, dear, I don't think we need to bore everyone with." "It's not boring at all, Thalia," I said, opening the double doors to the study. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing lens of the projector. In fact, I think your investors will find the financial management section particularly enlightening. I stepped back, allowing the first group of guests to filter in. Thalia pushed past them, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she hissed under her breath. "I'm being transparent," I whispered back. I hit the play button. On the far wall, a giant image of our father appeared, not the sick man he became, but the man he was. And then the audio began to play. Not music, but the sound of Thalia's voice, cold and demanding, echoing through the sterile, silent house. The room went cold. It wasn't the temperature, but the sudden, suffocating shift in the social atmosphere. The audio of Thalia's voice, sharp, impatient, and chillingly manipulative, filled the study. "Sign it, Dad." "Lyra is already looking at nursing homes. Do you want to die in a sterile box?" On the wall, the image of my father transitioned from a vibrant man in his prime to a photo I'd taken just weeks before his death. He looked small, confused, and utterly betrayed. Overlaid on his image were scans of the bank transfers: $10,000, $15,000, $8,000. Each one was time-stamped, a digital trail of blood leading straight to Thalia's gallery accounts. "Lyra, turn this off," Thalia shouted, her voice cracking as she lunged for the projector. But I stood in her way, my feet planted on the rug she had already marked for sale. "Why, Thalia? Is the narrative not curated enough for you? These are the people you wanted to impress. I thought you valued raw, emotional truth in your art." The guests were frozen, their champagne flutes held midair. I saw Julian, a major benefactor of the Ethelgard Museum, lower his glasses to stare at the screen. He was looking at a scan of the forged renunciation of inheritance, the one where my signature looked just a little too much like Thalia's practiced cursive. "Is this a joke?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Thalia, who was now trembling, her plum-colored dress suddenly looking garish against the cold light of the projector. "It's a misunderstanding," Thalia gasped, turning to the crowd. "My sister, she's been under a lot of strain, she's grieving, she's hallucinating these documents." "The bank doesn't hallucinate, Thalia," I said, my voice steady, ringing with the clarity of 3 years of silenced frustration. "And Dad didn't hallucinate the fear he felt when you cornered him. You told these people you were selling this house to give us both a future, but you were really selling it to cover the tracks of what you'd already stolen." A recording began to play, one I hadn't even listened to fully myself. It was the sound of the silver being moved, the clatter of grandmother's forks being dumped into a box. "She won't notice," Thalia's recorded voice whispered. "She's too busy playing martyr in the garden." Thalia looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, a hand to hold, or a way to spin the disaster. But she had surrounded herself with people of status, people who could not afford to be associated with elder abuse and fraud. One by one, they began to set their glasses down on the mahogany desk, the desk she had already sold out from under me. "I think we should leave," Julian said, his eyes fixed on Thalia with a look of pure, clinical disgust. "Julian, wait," Thalia pleaded, reaching for his arm. He stepped back as if her touch were toxic. The room began to empty, the quiet rustle of coats and the muffled sound of retreating footsteps creating a rhythmic funeral march for Thalia's reputation. Within minutes, the elite preview was a ghost town, leaving only the two of us in the flickering light of our father's face. Thalia turned to me, her face a mask of primal rage. "You just destroyed everything," she breathed. "My gallery, my name, I have nothing now." "No," I said, walking over to the projector and finally turning it off. The silence that followed was heavy, ancient. "You have exactly what you left me with. A house full of shadows and a debt you can't pay. Now get out of my study." Thalia didn't leave. Instead, she collapsed onto the velvet bench she'd bought to replace Dad's armchair, her face buried in her hands. The industrial fog walls seemed to close in on her. For a moment, she looked small, but I knew better than to mistake her defeat for remorse. "You don't understand," she whispered into her palms. "The gallery was everything. I was going to pay it all back once the estate settled. I was going to take care of you, Lyra. I just needed a bridge." "A bridge made of Dad's bones?" I asked. I walked to the mahogany desk and picked up the small brass key. You didn't need a bridge, Thalia. You needed a lifestyle you hadn't earned. You sold the silver because you couldn't bear the thought of one less gala or one less designer coat. You stole his peace so you could keep up appearances for people who didn't even stay to finish their drinks once they saw who you really were. She looked up, her mascara smudged, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. What now? You've ruined me. Are you going to call the police? Put your own sister in a cell. The police are a phone call I haven't decided on yet, I said, leaning against the doorframe. But the real estate agent, Vance, I've already spoken to him. I've shown him the original deed and the proof that the codicil was signed under duress. The house isn't for sale anymore, not on your terms. Thalia stood up, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. You can't keep this house. The taxes alone will bury you. You have no income, Lyra. You spent your career years changing bandages. I have the ledger, Thalia, I reminded her, and the USB drive. If I take these to the bank and the authorities, they'll freeze your accounts for the gallery. They'll claw back every cent you borrowed. You'll be the one buried in debt, not me. I walked toward the front door and opened it wide. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, the air smelling of wet pavement and worms. You're leaving, I said, tonight. It's midnight, Lyra. Where am I supposed to go? To one of those friends you were so busy charming earlier, I suggested. Or perhaps to the gallery. You can sleep among the raw, emotional art you love so much, but you aren't spending another night under this roof. You lost that right the second you put a green sticker on Mom's jewelry box. Thalia stared at me, searching for a flicker of the sister who used to let her have the bigger half of every cookie, the sister who always smoothed things over. She found nothing but a wall of cold stone. Slowly, she walked to the coat rack, grabbed her designer bag, and stepped out into the dark. She didn't look back. I watched her taillights disappear down the driveway, the red glow fading into the mist. I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. For the first time in 3 years, the house was silent. Not the heavy, stifling silence of a dying man, but the clean, empty silence of a space that had finally been purged. I went back to the kitchen, sat at the table, and pulled out the pawn shop receipt. I had work to do tomorrow. I had silver to bring home. The pawn shop was located in a part of the city Thalia usually avoided, a street where the neon signs flickered with a tired hum and the air smelled of exhaust and stale grease. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming with a tinny, lonely sound. Behind the scratched plexiglass sat a man named Garrick, his skin the texture of an old baseball glove. I slid the crumpled receipt across the counter. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. If the silver had already been melted or sold to a private collector, the last tangible piece of my grandmother's history was gone. Garrick adjusted his spectacles and peered at the slip. Vain, right? The lady who brought these in was in a real hurry, claimed they were excess baggage from a move. She was mistaken, I said, my voice tight. They're mine. I have the police report for the theft if you need it, though I'd prefer to settle this quietly. He looked at me for a long beat, measuring the dark circles under my eyes and the way I held myself, braced for more bad news. He didn't ask for the report. He simply grunted and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he was carrying the heavy, velvet-lined mahogany chest. I opened the lid. There they were. The heavy dinner forks, the ornate serving spoons, each piece tarnished but intact. I ran a thumb over the V engraved on the handles. It felt like touching a pulse. Cost you the original payout plus the interest, Garrick said. $1,200. I pulled out the envelope of cash I'd taken from the emergency fund Dad had kept in his bedside drawer. The one Thalia never knew about because she never bothered to sit by his bed long enough to find it. I counted out the bills, the weight of the silver now replacing the weight of the debt in my soul. When I got back to the house, I didn't go inside immediately. I sat on the porch steps, the silver chest resting on my knees. The industrial fog paint on the front door was already peeling at the edges, a testament to the cheap, rushed job Thalia had commissioned. The neighborhood was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. A moving truck pulled up to the curb. 2 men climbed out, holding a clipboard. Delivery for Thalia Vane, one asked, gesturing to the back of the truck. She doesn't live here anymore, I said, standing up. What is it? A velvet sofa and 2 marble pedestals, prepaid. I looked at the truck, then back at my hollowed-out home. Thalia was still spending money she didn't have, decorating a life that had already collapsed. Send them back to the warehouse, I told them. And tell the company to flag the account for fraud. The cardholder is deceased, and the person who used it doesn't have authorization. As the truck rumbled away, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakably Thalia's. Julian pulled his funding. The gallery is being audited. You've had your fun, Lyra. Now tell me how you're going to pay for Dad's final medical bills without the house sale. You're drowning yourself just to see me sink. I didn't reply. I walked into the kitchen, placed the silver in the empty sideboard, and picked up a polishing cloth. I had a different kind of audit in mind, one that involved the local tax assessor and a very specific set of ledgers. I spent the next 3 days in a different kind of mourning. I wasn't mourning my father anymore. I'd done that every day for 3 years. I was mourning the sister I thought I had. As I polished each piece of silver, the black tarnish staining my fingertips, I realized Thalia hadn't changed. She had simply finally run out of room to hide. I took the ledgers to a woman named Marin, an old friend of my father's who worked in forensic accounting. We sat in her small, sun-drenched office, the air smelling of peppermint tea and old paper. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she saw the sheer volume of loans Thalia had extracted. Lyra, Marin said, looking up over her spectacles. This isn't just a family squabble. This is systematic. She didn't just borrow money, she moved it through shell accounts tied to her gallery. If we present this to the estate executors, the codicil she signed will be voided instantly. But you know what that means for her, don't you? It means she loses the gallery, I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. And likely her freedom if the bank decides to pursue the fraud. Is that what you want? Marin asked gently. I looked out the window at a tree losing its leaves. I want to stop being afraid of the mail arriving. I want to stop feeling like a guest in my own life. When I returned home, I found Thalia sitting on the porch steps. She looked haggard. Her expensive plum dress was wrinkled, and her hair, once so perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a messy, greasy knot. She didn't look like a curator anymore. She looked like a ghost. The locks are changed, Lyra, she said, her voice devoid of its usual bite. I couldn't even get my shoes. Your shoes are in a box at the end of the driveway, I said, walking past her. I didn't invite her in. I stood at the door, the barrier between us feeling miles thick. Julian is suing me, she whispered, her lip trembling. He thinks I forged his recommendation for the museum board, too. Everyone is talking, Lyra. My name is. It's dirt. You made the dirt, Thalia. You just expected me to bury it for you. Please, she said, finally looking at me, her eyes brimming with genuine, terrified tears. If you take those ledgers to the authorities, I'm done. I'll have nothing. No one, just give me a year. I'll find a way to pay the estate back. I'll work a normal job. I'll do anything. I looked at her and felt a strange, hollow pang. I saw the little girl who used to be afraid of the dark, the sister I used to protect. But then I remembered the recording of her pressuring a confused man to sign away his daughter's security. I remembered the green stickers. I'm not going to the police today, I said. Relief flooded her face, a pathetic, gasping sound escaping her throat. Thank you, Lyra, thank you. I knew you still. But, I cut her off, you are going to sign a confession, a private, notarized statement admitting to the fraud and the forgery. You will surrender all claim to the house and the remaining assets. And you will move to the city, get that normal job, and you will never, ever ask me for a cent again. If you break any of those terms, Marin takes the original ledgers to the district attorney. Thalia's relief curdled into something bitter. You're holding me hostage. No, I said, opening the door. I'm setting us both free. You get to live your life, Thalia. You just don't get to live mine. Notary arrived at sunset. We sat at the mahogany desk, the same one Thalia had tried to sell, and the only sound was the scratching of her pen against the parchment. It was a heavy, final sound. When she finished, she pushed the document toward me with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself were scorching hot. "There," she said, her voice a thin wire. "You have your house. You have your silver. I hope the silence here is everything you wanted." She didn't wait for a goodbye. She grabbed her bag and walked out, her silhouette momentarily framed by the porch light before the darkness of the driveway swallowed her. This time, I didn't watch the taillights. I went to the kitchen and began to undo her staging. I peeled the industrial fog, paint away from the window frames where it had oversprayed. I moved the cold, velvet bench to the garage and brought my father's hand-carved birds back into the light. The house groaned and settled, as if it were finally exhaling a breath it had been holding since the funeral. A week later, I set the table. I used the grandmother's silver, the heavy weight of the forks feeling solid and right in my hands. I made the blackberry preserves Dad loved, the scent filling the kitchen until it finally drowned out the chemical smell of Thalia's renovations. I sat alone, but for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by the truth. I had received a letter from Julian. He'd made it clear that Thalia was barred from the city's social circles, but he also offered me a small position at the museum's archival department, a job that valued the very thing I had spent years doing, preserving what matters. I walked out to the porch and sat in the old wicker chair. The garden was overgrown, the weeds tall and unruly, but they were mine to pull. There were no green stickers on the trees, no sold signs in the yard. My phone vibrated on the side table. It was a notification from a social media account Thalia had forgotten to block me on. It was a photo of a cramped, dimly lit apartment and a hand holding a cheap paper cup of coffee. The caption was, "Starting over. New beginnings are the hardest art." I looked at the photo, then at the sprawling, messy beauty of my father's land. I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a need for more revenge. I simply felt a profound, quiet peace. Thalia was finally living a life that belonged to her, and I was finally living one that belonged to me. I stood up, tucked the brass key into my pocket, and went inside to finish my dinner. The silver caught the light of the setting sun, gleaming with a soft, steady glow that no amount of polish could fake. I was no longer the one who stayed behind. I was the one who moved forward, carrying the weight of my history with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The house was still, the shadows were just shadows, and for the first time the silence was enough.